Picture yourself in the year 67 AD, walking through the marble-paved streets of ancient Rome. The sun is high, burning of the morning mist as the forum buzzes with life. Senators in white togas debate policy beneath towering columns, merchants haggle over spices from the east, and slaves hurry with amphorae of wine balanced on their shoulders. Rome, the beating heart of an empire of 60 million, is alive with its usual symphony of power and commerce, and then, amid the crowd, a sight that makes the blood run cold, there, striding proudly through the forum, is the emperor himself, Nero, the man whose name already carried both awe and terror, a ruler as unpredictable as he was powerful. But what seizes the attention of every onlooker is not Nero's presence, it is the figure walking beside him. Draped in silks and heavy with jewels, she appears to be his new bride, the Empress of Rome. Her beauty seems almost unnatural, delicate features, soft skin, a poised grace that makes people whisper as she passes. But the whispers are not words of admiration, they are gasps of horror, because everyone who dares to look closely knows the truth. That beautiful young woman at Nero's side was not born female. Once, not long ago, that person had been a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to him, what he forced him to become, would go down as one of the most grotesque acts of psychological domination and physical mutilation in the entire annals of Roman history. The empire had seen cruelty before. It had seen blood spilled in the Colosseum, men executed in the circus, rivals poisoned in the shadows of the Palatine Hill. But this was something different. It was not just political violence, nor the cold efficiency of imperial power. It was the transformation of a living human being into an object, a dull craft to soothe the emperor's grief and feed his delusions. And this is where our story begins. What you are about to hear is not simply a tale of Roman decadence or the excesses of one deranged ruler. It is a story about the dangers of unchecked power, about how love can rot into obsession, grief into madness, and human life into something disposable. The name Sporus may not be familiar to you, but once you know it, it lingers like a shadow. Because behind the name is a tragedy that forces us to confront one of history's most unsettling truths, that the line between affection and cruelty, between devotion and destruction, is perilously thin when wielded by someone who believes themselves to be a god. To understand how Sporus' fate unfolded, we must first turn to the man at the center of this nightmare, Emperor Nero. And here lies a paradox, for Nero was not born a monster. In fact, his first years on the throne seemed to promise a new dawn for Rome, a golden age of peace and prosperity. But as you will see, the same man who once charmed the masses with theater and generosity would soon descend into paranoia, delusion, and unimaginable brutality. And in that descent, he would drag Sporus with him, transforming a young man into the ghost of a dead woman. This is the story of Sporus, and it begins with Nero's rise. When Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was only 16 years old. Imagine that for a moment. A boy barely past adolescence, suddenly declared ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known. His face still soft with youth, his voice not yet hardened by command, and yet by law and by fear his word carried the weight of life and death over tens of millions. To the Roman people, this seemed like the start of a golden era. For years, they had endured the heavy hand of emperors who ruled with suspicion and violence, Tiberius retreating into paranoia, Caligula descending into madness, Claudius manipulated by his court. But Nero, with his youthful energy and fresh charm, promised something new. The first years of his reign were astonishingly bright. Guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, Nero reduced taxes, expanded public games, and even poured money into rebuilding parts of Rome. Ordinary citizens adored him. Unlike the stiff, distant rulers before him, Nero reveled in the theater, the racetrack, and the stage. He was not above performing in public, to the horror of the aristocracy but the delight of the masses. Imagine an emperor stepping into the role of an actor, singing and playing the lyre while thousands watched, their ruler not above them, but among them. In those early years, Nero seemed to embody a dream, the idea that power could be wielded with generosity instead of cruelty. The Senate, weary from previous tyrants, cautiously applauded his reforms. Foreign diplomats reported back that Rome's new emperor was both charismatic and approachable. Even historians of the time, usually quick to sniff out weakness, admitted that the empire seemed hopeful, and yet, Beneath this glittering surface, shadows stirred. The young emperor was surrounded by constant pressure, whispers from the Senate, ambitions from the generals, manipulation from his mother Agrippina, one of the most formidable women in Roman history. Every decision Nero made was scrutinized. Every gesture weighed for signs of strength or weakness. Rome was a city where loyalty was purchased with fear, and where betrayal was often only a dagger's length away. The boy emperor's popularity rested on a fragile foundation, adoration of the crowds, and the delicate guidance of his advisors. But in Rome, foundations seldom remain steady, for absolute power is like a fire at first. It warms and illuminates, but without restraint it consumes everything it touches, and slowly, inevitably, Nero began to change. The more he tasted power, the more he craved freedom from restraint. Seneca's wisdom, once cherished, became an irritation. His mother's dominance, once necessary, became suffocating. And the weight of being at the pinnacle of an empire, surrounded by people who bowed but never spoke truth, began to twist something inside him. It was in these years, still early in his reign, that cracks began to show signs that the charming boy who had once dreamed of golden harmony would one day give way to the cruel man whose name would forever be etched into infamy. For now, the people cheered. The streets echoed with his name. Nero basked in the glow of their love, mistaking it for permanence. But already, the seeds of paranoia and obsession were sprouting in the shadows of his mind. And soon, one woman beautiful, ambitious, and more dangerous than anyone realized would step into his life and change the course of history forever. Her name was Poppa Sabina. In the gilded cage Nero built for her, Poppa Sabina discovered both immense power and mortal danger. Most women in the imperial court had long ago learned the art of survival. They flattered, they yielded, and above all, they never contradicted the emperor. But Poppa was different. She refused to bow completely. Even to the man who held the world in his hands, she was intelligent. Far more than Nero perhaps ever understood. Behind her beauty lay a keen political instinct. She leveraged her position to advance her family's fortunes, weaving alliances that stretched through Rome's senatorial class. Every gift Nero showered upon her, she converted into influence. Land meant loyal clients. Jewelry became tokens of patronage. Poppa was not simply the emperor's ornament. She was building her own power base, a subtle fortress within the palace. But the very independence that made her formidable also made her dangerous. Unlike the trembling courtiers who agreed with every imperial whim, Poppa had the audacity to criticize. When Nero botched a performance on stage, she did not hide her disdain. When he spent more time indulging in spectacles than governing, she reminded him sometimes sharply of his duties as a husband and ruler. Ancient sources describe her as bold enough to mock him, clever enough to sting his pride without always provoking immediate rage. This was unthinkable in Rome. Even senators bowed under the weight of Nero's moods, offering hollow praises to keep their heads on their shoulders. Yet here was the empress herself, daring to stand her ground. To Nero, this must have been intoxicating at first, a woman who did not treat him as a god but as a man. But in the volatile cauldron of his mind, admiration could turn to fury. In a heartbeat, their marriage became a dangerous dance. On one side, Poppa enjoyed a level of influence no woman had ever held in the empire. On the other, every word she spoke risked lighting the fuse of Nero's volcanic temper. And there was another danger, more subtle, but just as deadly. For all her brilliance, Poppa underestimated the depth of Nero's instability. She believed she could manage his moods, that she could shape him to her will. But this was not a man who could be shaped. This was a ruler who blurred the line between love and ownership, who believed that to criticize him was not the voice of reason but the betrayal of devotion. In the marble halls of Rome, amid the perfume of roses and the glow of golden lamps, Poppa thought she was playing a game of power. What she did not realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that she was playing with fire, and fire, once unleashed, consumes indiscriminately. The fateful spark would ignite one ordinary day in what began as a domestic argument but would end as one of the most infamous tragedies in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Poppa Sabina entered Nero's world like a spark tossed into dry brush. She was not merely beautiful, though ancient writers insist her beauty was dazzling enough to halt conversation when she entered a room. She was clever, ambitious, and keenly aware of the power she carried in a court where appearances were as sharp as daggers. Nero, trapped in a cold and loveless marriage with Octavia, daughter of the late Emperor Claudius, Poppa seemed like everything he had ever wanted, but had been denied. Octavia was quiet, dutiful, and politically convenient, an empress in name only, a shadow of loyalty to Rome's previous dynasty. She offered Nero stability, but not passion. She brought him legitimacy, but not adoration. For a young ruler already intoxicated with performance and spectacle, Octavia's restraint felt like a chain. Poppa was the opposite of chains. She was fire, vivacious where Octavia was subdued, commanding where Octavia was reserved. Poppa craved attention and wielded it with precision. She was not content to fade into the background of banquets and ceremonies. She thrived in the glow of the imperial court, turning every glance into advantage, every whisper into a stepping stone. She was already well versed in the dangerous game of Roman politics, having been married once before to Otho, a man who would later claim the throne himself. To survive in Rome was to be both beautiful and shrewd, and Poppa was both in abundance. When Nero first set eyes on her, their affair was scandalous enough to ignite gossip across the empire. Rome was no stranger to marital betrayals among the elite, but this was different. It was not merely adultery, it was obsession. What began as an affair grew into something darker, more consuming. Nero did not simply want Poppa as a lover. He wanted her as the embodiment of everything he desired: glory, admiration, and the perfect reflection of his own grandiosity. She understood this, and she played the role with flawless skill. To be adored by the emperor was to wield power beyond measure, but it was also to stand on a knife's edge. One day you could be Rome's queen, the next a corpse abandoned in the Tiber. Poppa walked that edge fearlessly, confident in her ability to keep Nero's passion alive. But what perhaps made her most dangerous was not her beauty, nor her ambition, but her ability to make Nero believe that she shared his dreams of eternal greatness. She flattered his artistic ambitions, laughed at his theatrical jokes, encouraged his dreams of being worshipped not merely as emperor, but as a living god. To a man whose soul craved affirmation, she was intoxicating, and soon, intoxication would prove more powerful than loyalty, more persuasive than reason, and more destructive than any dagger. For as Nero fell deeper under Poppa's spell, he began dismantling the fragile structures that had once anchored his rule. Octavia, once his tie to the Julio-Claudian line, would be cast aside. Allies who whispered caution would be silenced. And the empire, still dazzled by games and festivals, had no idea that their emperor's heart had been captured in a way that would end in blood. Poppa Sabina was not just a mistress. She was the axis upon which Nero's destiny began to turn, and the consequences of that turn would reach far beyond the walls of the palace. The year was 65 AD. By then, Nero's marriage to Poppa Sabina had become as volatile as it was passionate. The palace walls had witnessed countless quarrels between them, words sharpened like daggers, silences heavy with unspoken threats. But one argument, recorded in fragments by ancient historians, would end in tragedy that neither Rome nor Nero himself could ever forget. The exact cause of that day's quarrel is lost to time, blurred by rumor and the biases of chroniclers. Tacitus claimed it was over Nero's late nights at the circus, his obsession with chariot racing eclipsing his duties at home. Others whispered it was over his endless devotion to theatre, a humiliation in the eyes of the Roman elite who despised emperors behaving as common entertainers. Still, others suggest the argument was fueled by jealousy, by Poppa's willingness to confront him about neglecting her and their unborn child. Yes, Poppa was pregnant then, carrying what would have been their second child. This alone might have heightened her resolve. Perhaps she felt bolder, unwilling to tolerate Nero's erratic indulgences while she bore the future of Rome. Perhaps she hoped, even in the shadow of his temper, that she could still remind him of duty and reason. But to challenge Nero was to strike at his most fragile place, his pride. The argument escalated with terrifying speed. Words became shouts, shouts became accusations. In the marble chambers of the palace, where frescoes of gods looked down with painted indifference, the emperor of the world lost control of himself. According to some sources, he struck her once, a violent blow to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained attack, a fit of rage so uncontrolled that it left her bleeding and broken on the cold floor. The effect was catastrophic. The life within her, the child who might have stabilized the dynasty, who might have given Nero an heir, was extinguished in an instant. Poppa herself, the woman who had once been the center of his world, lay fatally injured, and then horror. dawned. Imagine Nero in that moment, the emperor who commanded legions, who could summon executions with a word, staring at the consequences of his own hands. Ancient writers describe him as collapsing beside her body, begging forgiveness one moment and commanding her to live the next, as though imperial power might extend even over death. Physicians were summoned, threatened with torture if they failed, bribed with fortunes if they succeeded. But Rome's greatest healers could not undo what had been done. Within hours, Poppa Sabina was dead. With her died not only Nero's unborn, but the last fragile tether holding his sanity. Historians across centuries debated whether the act was deliberate or accidental, whether it was the sudden rage of a man incapable of self-control or the unconscious manifestation of his obsession destroying what he loved because he could not bear its independence. But whatever the motive, the result was the same. Nero had killed the woman who had defined his reign, and with her death, something inside him fractured beyond repair. The empire would not only mourn a murdered empress, it would soon witness the descent of its ruler into grief so twisted, so delusional, that it reshaped the fate of another innocent life. What began as a courtly scandal soon twisted into something darker. Rome had seen emperors with mistresses before Caesar had Cleopatra, and countless senators flaunted their lovers without shame. But what unfolded between Nero and Poppa Sabina was not a typical affair. It was obsession, the kind that burns too brightly to last, the kind that consumes everything around it. Nero could not bear the idea of Poppa belonging to anyone else, not even in memory. Jealousy clouded his judgment. It is said that he stationed guards around her constantly, not for her safety, but to monitor her every glance, every word, every smile directed toward another man. At banquets, his gaze would follow her like a shadow, ready to erupt in fury if he thought she had drawn admiration from others. And then there were the gifts. Ancient sources describe a stream of extravagance flowing from the imperial treasury straight into her hands. Jewels from India, silks from distant China, rare perfumes shipped across the desert from Arabia. Entire estates were granted to her family, elevating them to heights of influence they had never dreamed of. It was as though Nero believed that by showering her in luxury, he could bind her spirit to his forever. But possession, not devotion, was the beating heart of this love. Even marriage could not satisfy Nero's hunger. When he divorced Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, it shocked Rome to its core. Octavia was beloved by the people, known for her quiet dignity and loyalty. Casting her aside made Nero appear ungrateful, reckless, and dangerously unpredictable. Yet in Nero's mind, it was a necessary step, proof that Poppa alone mattered. The wedding that followed was unlike anything the empire had seen before. Nero spared no expense. Golden wreaths glittered beneath torchlight, musicians filled the air with triumphal hymns, and courtiers pretended to smile while secretly shuddering at the emperor's audacity. The marriage was not just a union, it was Nero's declaration that his obsession was law, that his desires could reshape the empire itself. But obsession rarely stops at the altar. Nero began to isolate Poppa from the outside world. Her family, her friends, even her allies in the court were pushed aside. Around her, Nero built a world of mirrors, advisors, servants and attendants whose very positions depended entirely on him. Their loyalty was to the emperor, not to her, ensuring she could never move without his shadow falling across her path. He filled his palaces with portraits and sculptures of her, not only for public display but for his private chambers as well. Some accounts claim he would sit for hours simply watching her walk, his eyes never leaving her, as though she were a living statue carved for his delight. This was not love, it was possession made flesh, the transformation of a woman into an ornament, a treasure displayed not because of what she was, but because she belonged to him. And yet, Poppa was not a passive figure in this theatre. She was sharp enough to recognize both the power and the peril of Nero's passion. She used his obsession to elevate her family, to weave her own network of influence. But deep within the glittering halls, she must have known that every step was dangerous, that a man who cannot distinguish between love and ownership is a man who might one day destroy the very thing he cherishes. The court, meanwhile, whispered in fear. They saw the emperor slipping further from reason, tightening his grip on a woman who could never fully belong to him. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the inevitable. The moment when passion would ignite into destruction, and that moment was not far away. The palace fell into silence after Popper's death, a silence so heavy it seemed to seep into the marble walls, into the flickering oil lamps, into the very air that hung over Rome. For the emperor had committed an unthinkable act. He had struck down the woman he claimed to love more than life itself. And in that moment, grief did not humble Nero, it devoured him. Roman custom dictated that the dead be burned swiftly, their ashes placed in family tombs. But Nero could not accept such finality. He refused to let fire consume what he had lost. Instead, he ordered Popper's body embalmed and placed within a tomb more elaborate than that of any empress before her. He surrounded her with treasures, perfumes, and jewels, as if wealth could bribe death into returning her. But the most disturbing part was not the tomb, it was what followed. Nero declared her divine, a goddess whose cult was to be honored by Rome itself. He forced senators and courtiers to speak of her in the present tense, as though she still lived. At banquets, her couch was left empty, her place preserved. The court played along, their smiles brittle, their words carefully chosen, for any hint of reality that Popper was gone might cost them their lives. Nero himself wandered the palace, Paul speaking to her embalmed body, whispering as though she could hear him. Some said he spent hours in her chamber, commanding servants to bring her the fruits, wines, and delicacies she once loved, only to sit in silence beside her, as though awaiting a reply. Others claimed he raged at her corpse, berating her for leaving him, as though even death were an act of betrayal. This was not mourning in the Roman sense, not the dignified grief expected of an emperor. It was the unraveling of reality. Nero's grief had become obsession, and obsession fed his delusion. The empire watched its ruler lose himself in rituals that bordered on madness. The courtiers, trapped in this theater of grief, played their parts with trembling precision. To defy the illusion was to risk exile or worse. Senators who suggested the emperor remarry were banished. Advisors who counseled him to move on were silenced. Rome itself was now expected to bow not just to its emperor, but to the ghost he refused to release, and in this fragile, dangerous state of denial, Nero began to seek something impossible. He longed not simply to honor Popper, but to bring her back, to erase the crime his hands had committed, to undo death itself. It was in this darkness, in the shadow of embalmed love and whispered madness, that the eyes of the emperor fell upon a young boy within the palace walls, a boy whose face carried a haunting resemblance to the woman he had lost. That boy's name was Sporus. Sporus was young when Nero first noticed him, no more than 14 or 15, on the cusp between boyhood and manhood. He was born into slavery within the imperial household, a world where children were raised not by parents, but by the expectations of the empire. Yet fortune, at least for a time, had smiled on him. Sporus was manumitted, granted freedom in his youth, and trained for the kinds of duties that kept the palace machine running: administration, errands, perhaps minor ceremonial roles. For a freedman in service to the emperor, this was considered a privileged life. He lived in marble halls, not the filth of Rome's slums. He dined on bread and olives, not scraps from the gutter. But privilege in the palace was a double-edged sword. It meant his survival depended entirely on the whims of imperial favor, and favor could shift in an instant. What drew Nero's gaze was not Sporus' education or his skills. It was his face. Ancient writers agree that the boy bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Popper, particularly in his eyes, in the delicate shape of his cheeks and jaw. In a culture where Romans often believed physical likeness revealed some spiritual echo, the similarity must have seemed uncanny, even supernatural. For Nero, still adrift in the madness of grief, Sporus was not simply a boy. He was a vision, a chance to undo the irreversible. Imagine that first meeting. The emperor's gaze locking onto the boy, studying him as though he were looking through him to someone else. To Nero's shattered mind, Sporus was not Sporus. He was Popper returned, her ghost wearing a new form. There was, of course, one problem. Sporus was male. But for a man who fancied himself divine, who believed his will could bend the world to his desires, this was no obstacle. Nero had spent months whispering to a corpse. Now he saw before him a living canvas, one he believed could be reshaped into the likeness of what he had lost. And so the decision was made. Sporus would not live as himself any longer. He would become Popper Sabina, reborn not by choice, but by imperial command. For Sporus, the nightmare began in silence. How could he refuse? No one refused Nero and lived. In an empire where even senators and generals trembled before the emperor's moods, What chance did a boy of 15 have? His resemblance to Popper, once merely a quirk of fate, had become his curse. From that moment on, Sporus was no longer a person in the eyes of Rome's most powerful man. He was an idea, a ghost made flesh, a vessel through which Nero hoped to deceive both the world and himself. What followed would be one of the most disturbing acts of control in history, a transformation not only of appearance, but of identity itself. The decision was made in Nero's mind, and in Rome, when the emperor willed something, reality itself bent to match his desire. Sporus would not remain a boy. He would be remade into Popper. To modern ears, what followed sounds like the darkest of violations, and even to ancient Romans, accustomed as they were to brutality, it shocked the court. Nero summoned his physicians, the best that the empire could provide, and commanded them to perform a surgery that would forever alter Sporus' body. This was not medicine. This was mutilation in the name of obsession. Surgery in the first century was primitive and perilous. There were no sterile instruments, no anesthesia beyond crude herbs or strong wine. The tools were bronze and iron knives, clamps, cautery irons heated in flames. The risk of infection was immense. Many who underwent even minor operations did not survive. For Sporus, the procedure was not to heal, but to erase. He would have been held down by guards as the physicians approached, his screams echoing through the palace walls. There was no consent, no mercy, only the emperor's will. The operation, meant to strip away the physical markers of his masculinity, left wounds that were not only physical but psychological. Sporus survived, though survival was its own curse. His body was changed, his future stolen. He would never marry of his own will, never father children, never live as himself again. But Nero was not finished. The transformation was more than flesh, it was identity. Once Sporus' body had been broken to suit the emperor's fantasy, the grooming began. His wardrobe was redesigned entirely, filled with silks and gowns crafted by the finest seamstresses. Jewelers set about creating ornaments specifically for him, some made from the very gems that had once adorned Popper herself. These were not gifts, they were chains, glittering shackles binding him to a role he never chose. Cosmetics became part of his daily ritual. Kohl to widen his eyes, powders to soften his face, rouge to imitate the flush of feminine beauty. Hairdressers spent hours curling and pinning his hair in elaborate styles, heating iron rods until they hissed, shaping him into a reflection of a dead empress. Every morning, as he stared into polished bronze mirrors, he saw not himself, but the ghost Nero demanded him to become. Tutors were appointed to teach him how to walk, how to sit, how to hold his hands with delicacy. He learned how to lower his gaze modestly, how to shift his weight with grace, how to conceal the strength of a boy within gestures of fragility. Even his voice was trained, forced into higher tones, coached in the speech patterns of Roman women. Every word he spoke was a light pressed into his throat. Day by day, lesson by lesson, Sporus was erased. Can you imagine the torture? To be young, to feel your own identity hardening into place, and then to have it stripped away by decree, to be told, not asked, that you are no longer who you are, that you will become someone else entirely. Every glance in the mirror was a reminder that his face, his body, his life no longer belonged to him, and still, he could not resist. To defy Nero was to invite death. The emperor's delusion had become law, and the boy had no choice but to play the part. Soon, Rome itself would be invited to witness the culmination of this grotesque transformation. For Nero did not intend for Sporus to remain merely a private fantasy. He would make his obsession public. He would marry the boy not as Sporus, but as Popper Sabina reborn. Once the surgery was complete and the boy's fate sealed, the real transformation began, not of body, but of spirit. Sporus was no longer treated as himself. He was treated as a vessel, a canvas on which Nero would repaint the features of his dead wife. Every detail of his life was orchestrated to erase his identity and replace it with that of Popper Sabina. The palace became his prison and his theatre. Seamstresses worked tirelessly, crafting gowns of flowing silk dyed in Tyrian purple, the rarest and most expensive color in the empire, a dye worth more than gold itself. Jewelers shaped delicate ornaments from pearls and emeralds, many taken directly from Popper's collection, as if by draping Sporus in her jewels, Nero could conjure her spirit. Even the emperor's attendants whispered that the boy looked less like himself each day, and more like the shadow of the woman who haunted Nero's grief. Cosmetics became a ritual of control. Every morning, servants applied kohl to whiten Sporus. eyes, rouge to mimic the bloom of life in his cheeks, powders to soften the angles of his jaw. The hours dragged on as hairdressers twisted and pinned his locks into intricate styles, using heated bronze rods and golden pins. These sessions were not about beauty. They were about erasure. Each curl, each painted line, each jewel was another step in burying Sporus beneath a mask. But perhaps the cruelest lessons were not physical. Tutors were assigned to reshape his behavior, to teach him the language of femininity as Rome understood it. He was taught to lower his gaze in modesty, to move with calculated grace, to sit with garments flowing just so. He practiced how to fold his hands, how to smile when spoken to, how to feign the delicacy of a woman who had never existed. Even his voice was trained raised into softer tones, taught to mimic the lilting cadence of Popper's speech. This was not simply performance. It was psychological warfare. Every gesture, every step, reminded Sporus that his old self was gone. He was no longer allowed to laugh freely, to speak as he once had, to walk as his body naturally moved. He lived as a ghost in his own skin, forced to carry memories that were not his own, and Nero encouraged the illusion. He spoke to Sporus not as if he were a boy in disguise, but as though he were truly Popper returned from death. He reminisced about moments Sporus had never lived, recalling shared meals, whispered promises, and nights in golden chambers, as though the boy could be persuaded into believing memories that belonged to another life. Each time Sporus was forced to nod, to smile, to pretend, the knife of grief twisted deeper. Imagine waking each day in a chamber decorated with another person's image portraits of Popper on the walls, her perfumes lingering in the air, her gowns fitted to your body. Imagine looking into a mirror and seeing not yourself, but the carefully constructed face of someone else staring back. This was Sporus' reality. Every morning, he was reminded that he was no longer Sporus. He was Nero's doll-dressed, painted, and drilled into becoming a living effigy of the woman the emperor had killed, and soon the ultimate humiliation awaited him. For Nero had no intention of hiding his creation away. He would display Sporus before the entire empire, not as a boy, but as his wife. The emperor would wed his doll in a ceremony that marked the very institution of marriage, binding grief, delusion, and cruelty into a single grotesque spectacle. The wedding of horror was approaching. Spring of 67 AD. Rome prepared itself for a spectacle unlike any other wedding, announced by decree of the emperor himself. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about an imperial marriage. Emperors had long used such ceremonies to display their wealth, their power, and their place above ordinary mortals. But this one was different. The whispers began even before the invitations were carved onto ivory tablets and delivered across the empire. The bride was not a woman at all. The bride was Sporus.by then. The boy had been molded into Popper's reflection so thoroughly that even those who had known him before found it difficult to look upon his face without feeling unsettled. Draped in silks, hair arranged in ornate curls pinned with golden combs, he appeared every inch the Empress Nero demanded him to be. But beneath the jewels, beneath the kohl-lined eyes and powdered cheeks, he remained a prisoner forced to act out a role written in another's memory. The ceremony itself was staged with a magnificence meant to stun the empire into submission. Nero spared no expense. The great hall of the palace was transformed into a garden of splendor, filled with flowers imported from Africa and Egypt, their scent mingling with the smoke of thousands of oil lamps that cast the room in a golden glow. Musicians played wedding hymns while guest senators, generals, courtiers filed in, their expressions carefully schooled into masks of joy. None dared betray the truth on their faces. And then the ritual began. Nero, dressed in robes of imperial purple, took Sporus by the hand. The boy's gown shimmered with embroidery of silver and gold. His veil lowered as though he were truly a Roman bride. The vows were spoken, the hands joined, the sacred bread shared. Legal documents were signed, witnessed by Rome's most powerful men, their hands trembling as they wrote their names beside the emperor's madness. It was a wedding in every outward form. But those who watched closely knew what they were witnessing was no union, but a desecration. Here stood the emperor of Rome, marrying a surgically altered boy, a living effigy of the wife he had killed. And here stood the boy himself, forced to smile, to nod, to endure. The guests applauded, offering congratulations, presenting gifts of gold and silver. Yet beneath the applause lay unease, even horror. It was one thing to indulge an emperor's eccentricities in private. It was another to be compelled to act as though his delusion were law, to bow before a fiction dressed in silk and jewels, but Nero believed that was the most healing truth of all. To him, this was not a performance. It was reality. In his mind, Popper had returned. His grief had been undone. Death itself had been defied. And from that day forward, Sporus was no longer Sporus. He was Sabina, Empress of Rome. He was expected to sit beside Nero at feasts, to accompany him in public, to play the role of a wife with absolute devotion. He was given his own household staff, his own attendants, even his own ceremonial duties. To the outside world, he was treated as though he truly were the Empress reborn, but behind the golden walls, behind the smiles and ceremonies, lay a crueler truth. Every morning, every evening, every word spoken in Nero's presence was a reminder that Sporus' identity had been erased. He was no longer a person, he was a symbol, a ghost resurrected, a doll forced to dance to the tune of grief and obsession. Rome had never seen such a wedding before, and it would never forget it. After the grotesque wedding, Sporus' world became a theatre in which he had no script of his own. To Rome, he was now Sabina, the empress cloaked in luxury, paraded through the city beside the emperor, treated with the ceremonial honors of an imperial consort. But beneath the silks and jewels lay a truth as suffocating as iron shackles. Sporus had ceased to exist. Nero did not merely want him to look like Popper, he demanded that he live as her. Sporus was given a staff of attendants, his own quarters within the palace, and an income drawn directly from the imperial treasury. He travelled in a gilded litter carried by slaves, with guards marching in formation. At public banquets, he reclined on couches beside Nero, his veil adjusted just so, his gestures rehearsed until they became second nature. Courtiers bowed to him, senators addressed him with the deference owed to an empress on the surface. This was a life of unimaginable privilege. But privilege is meaningless when it is rooted in the destruction of the self. Each jewel was a reminder of what he was forced to replace. Each bow from a senator was an acknowledgement not of him, but of the dead woman whose name had been stolen and placed upon his shoulders. For Nero, the illusion was complete. He spoke to Sporus as if he were truly Popper returned from the grave, recalling memories that Sporus had never lived. "Do you remember," Nero would say, "that evening in the garden, when the stars glowed above us?" And Sporus would nod, though he had never been there. "Do you recall," Nero would murmur, "the vows we whispered before the gods?" And Sporus would smile faintly, though the words were not his. Each response was an act of survival. In time, Sporus became a master of performance. Ancient accounts suggest he developed a preternatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods, answering as though he truly remembered events that had never been his. He became fluent in another person's past, a ghost writer of a life that had ended in violence. And yet, as the months passed, he grew more withdrawn, more melancholic. Publicly, he played the part perfectly. Privately, he was a boy fading into silence. Every morning, he awoke in chambers decorated with Popper's likeness. Every reflection in polished bronze showed him not as himself, but as the Empress Nero demanded him to be. Even his laughter was borrowed, his voice trained to echo a woman he had never met. Imagine the strain, to live in a world where even your own memories are treated as counterfeit, where your survival depends on convincing your captor that you are not you. For more than 2 years, Sporus endured this charade. To Rome, he was the empress of the empire, radiant in silk and gold. To Nero, he was proof that grief could be undone, that death could be mocked and conquered. But to himself, he was nothing, an echo, a shadow, a boy who had been turned into a living doll. And yet, even this was not the end of his torment. For Nero's hunger for spectacle would soon draw him across the sea to Greece, where the emperor longed to showcase his artistry to the world. And of course, Sporus the doll, the ghost, the empress in silk would be displayed before foreign crowds as well. The humiliation was about to grow even greater. In 66 AD, Nero announced what he believed would be the pinnacle of his reign, not a military campaign, not a political reform, but an artistic journey. He would travel to Greece, the land of Homer, of theatre, of Olympic glory, and there he would prove himself not merely an emperor, but an artist worthy of immortality. To Nero, this tour was destiny. He had always seen himself as more than a ruler. He was an actor, a poet, a musician, a genius whose talents demanded recognition. Beyond Rome's rigid walls, Greece, with its centuries of cultural prestige, would be the perfect stage. He would compete in festivals, sing before judges, and crown himself with laurels not won by conquest, but by applause, and so the imperial entourage set out, lavish and enormous, swallowing resources that might have supplied armies. Among the glittering procession, one figure stood out, Sporus, dressed as empress, carried beside Nero in a litter draped with purple silk. To Gris, this must have been a vision both baffling and grotesque. The conqueror, the ruler of Rome, arrived not with a queen, but with a boy parading as his dead wife, forced to act the part of consort in full view of foreign dignitaries. Imagine the stunned silence of Greek aristocrats, men who had studied philosophy and history, watching as Sporus was presented at ceremonies as a biner. No one dared laugh not when legions stood at Nero's back. Instead, they applauded, their faces masked of courtesy, while their eyes betrayed disbelief. Behind closed doors, whispers no doubt spread. Was the emperor of Rome mad, or simply monstrous? Yet Nero revelled in it. At every performance, he demanded victory, and victory he received. Judges dared not deny him. Crowds were compelled to cheer. He raced chariots, recited poetry, sang operatic laments, and returned crowned in laurel wreaths, his triumphs written in advance, his illusions reinforced. And always beside him, Sporus played his role, seated in silks, offering delicate gestures, smiling faintly as though he were truly the empress Rome had last ought to owe the Greeks. It was theatre. To Nero, it was reality. To Sporus, it was torment without end. He had become more than Nero's doll. He had become a spectacle paraded across nations, his very existence a performance stage for the world. And yet, even as Nero basked in false glory, the empire he ruled was unraveling. His neglect of governance, his extravagance, and his delusions were igniting discontent across Rome and its provinces. Rebellion simmered, governors whispered, and the Praetorian Guard began to question their loyalty. While Nero sang in Corinth and paraded Sporus through festivals, the empire itself was sliding toward collapse. By the time Nero returned from Greece, garlanded with laurels of hollow victories, the Senate had begun to stir. The soldiers who once held his name now murmured of betrayal. And when rebellion finally broke, it would not matter how many songs Nero had sung or how many crowns he had claimed. The empire was preparing to turn on him. And in his final, desperate days, Sporus would remain at his side, still bound, still trapped, still forced to follow the emperor into the abyss. By 68 AD, Nero's dream of eternal glory had rotted into a nightmare. While he sang before Greek crowds and crowned himself with laurels, rebellion had spread like wildfire through the empire. Provinces rose in defiance, generals refused his orders, and governors weighed their chances at seizing power. Even the Praetorian Guard, the very body sworn to protect him, wavered. The same soldiers who had once cheered his spectacles now whispered that Rome deserved better. The Senate, sensing the shifting winds, declared Nero a public enemy. It was the ultimate condemnation. The emperor of Rome, stripped of legitimacy, his own city turning against him. Overnight, the man who had commanded 30 legions became a fugitive. Nero fled the city with only a handful of loyal attendants, and Sporus was among them. Even in the shadow of death, Nero could not leave behind the grotesque echo of Popper he had created. Sporus rode with him, veiled and silent, the living ghost who had haunted the emperor's final years. Their flight led them to a villa outside Rome. There, surrounded by olive groves and silence, Nero's desperation curdled into madness. He raved of escape plans, perhaps fleeing to the east, perhaps begging for sanctuary in Egypt, perhaps even throwing himself upon the mercy of the Parthian king. But each plan collapsed under the weight of reality. The empire no longer wanted him in the villa. With his enemies closing in, Nero turned once more to theatre. He rehearsed his death as though it were a role upon the stage. He asked attendants to show him how to die gracefully, how to fall upon a sword without disgrace. He wept not for his empire, but for his art. What an artist dies in me, he lamented, as though history would mourn his voice more than his tyranny to last. The sound of horses thundered in the distant. Soldiers sent to arrest him. Nero panicked. Too cowardly to take his own life unaided, he begged his secretary Epaphroditus to drive the blade home. And so, with shaking hands, Nero pressed the dagger to his throat and ended his reign in blood. For Rome, it was a moment of both relief and terror. The tyrant was gone, but the empire stood on the brink of chaos. For Sporus, it was something else entirely. The man who had destroyed his identity, who had bound him to a living death, was gone. And yet, freedom did not follow. Sporus remained in the villa, still draped in silks, still addressed as Sabina. But now he was no longer the beloved of an emperor, he was the possession of a dead man. And in a Rome tearing itself apart with civil war, possessions of value were rarely left unclaimed. Nero's death was not the end of Sporus' ordeal. It was only the beginning of a new cycle of exploitation, as the boy who had been turned into a doll became a prize to be passed between men who saw in him not a person, but a tool. With Nero gone, Rome erupted into chaos. The empire had no heir, no clear succession, and suddenly generals and governors across the provinces rushed to seize the throne. Civil war loomed, and in the corridors of power, alliances shifted like sand in the wind, and in the midst of it all was Sporus. He was not seen as a boy, nor even as himself. He was a possession and ornament of Nero's reign, a living symbol of the late emperor's obsessions. Whoever controlled Sporus controlled that symbol, and in a Rome obsessed with appearances, symbols mattered almost as much as legions. First, Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious praetorian prefect, claimed him. He paraded Sporus as though inheriting Nero's favorite made him heir to Nero's power. For Sabinus, Sporus was not a human companion but a trophy, proof that he was the true successor to the dead emperor's legacy. But Sabinus' ambitions quickly collapsed, and Sporus was seized again. Next came Otho, once Poppa's first husband, and now, briefly, Emperor of Rome. To him, keeping Sporus was a bitter irony, a chance to reclaim, in twisted form, the wife he had lost to Nero's lust. Imagine the cruelty of it. The boy forced once more into the role of Poppa, now in the household of the very man she had once abandoned. Otho held him only a short time, but even that short captivity deepened Sporus' humiliation. Then Vitellius rose, and in Vitellius, Sporus' fate grew darker still. The new emperor, gluttonous and cruel, saw in Sporus not just a trophy but a tool for entertainment. He ordered that the boy be kept in the same role Nero had created for him, dressed as an empress, veiled in silks, paraded before the court as though he was still Poppa Sabina. To Vitellius, Sporus was an exotic curiosity, an object of grotesque amusement taught at each turn. Sporus was passed like property, his name and body chained to memories that were never his. The irony was cruel. He had outlived Nero, but not Nero's shadow. To Rome's new rulers, he was not a survivor. He was an inheritance, and yet, within Sporus, some spark of defiance remained. He had endured mutilation, ceremony, and the slow erasure of self. He had survived Nero's delusion and the ambitions of men who treated him as a prize. But Vitellius was preparing something far worse, something that would push Sporus to make the only choice still within his power. Vitellius, the new emperor, was a man of appetites, food, spectacle, cruelty. He had inherited Sporus not as a consort, not even as a companion, but as a novelty. And in his hunger to impress the Roman mob with shocking entertainments, he devised a plan that would drag Sporus into the darkest depths of humiliation. The idea was simple and horrifying. Sporus would be forced to play a part in the arena, not as a gladiator, not as a combatant, but as a victim in one of the elaborate theatrical executions that Rome had come to love. These were grotesque reenactments of myths, staged not with actors but with living human beings, whose suffering entertained the masses. Vitellius selected a myth infamous for its cruelty, the story of Proserpina, the maiden seized by the god of the underworld and dragged into darkness against her will. Sporus, dressed as a bride in silks and veil, would be paraded into the Colosseum before thousands of cheering spectators. Then, before their eyes, he would be violated, humiliated, and destroyed, his body made a stage upon which myth and mockery blurred into one for Sporus, who had already lived years as a shadow of another's wife. This was the final degradation. To be stripped, paraded, and abused before the jeering masses was more than he could endure. He had been forced into silence, into obedience, into a role he never chose. But this public theatre of cruelty was the one boundary he would not allow himself to cross, and so, faced with a fate worse than death, Sporus chose his own end. Ancient sources differ on the details, but most agree he took poison before he could be forced into the arena. A final act of defiance from a boy who had been denied every other choice. He was perhaps 20 years old. The audience never got its spectacle. Vitellius lost his prize. But in death, Sporus reclaimed something that had been stolen from him since the day Nero first fixed his gaze upon him. Agency.it was a tragic liberation, but liberation nonetheless. After Sporus' death, Rome moved on with the brutal swiftness of an empire accustomed to blood. Civil wars raged, emperors rose and fell, and the boy who had been forced to live as a dead woman became little more than a footnote in the chronicles of imperial decadence. Ancient historians Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio recorded his existence, but not with compassion. To them, Sporus was not a person but a symbol, evidence of Nero's excess and Rome's corruption. His name was invoked as shorthand for imperial madness. His suffering reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when emperors confuse power with divinity. His humanity was stripped away even in memory. But if we read between the lines of these accounts, if we allow ourselves to imagine the silences, a different picture emerges. Not just a grotesque story of imperial indulgence, but the story of a child caught in the gears of absolute power. A boy whose resemblance to a dead empress sealed his fate. A youth forced to endure surgery, erasure, and years of living as a ghost in Silk. In Sporus' survival too, almost 3 years beside Nero, there is evidence of astonishing resilience. To navigate the moods of a man like Nero required not only obedience but intelligence. Sporus learned how to play the role so perfectly that even the emperor's illusions held together. Every nod, every smile, every fabricated memory was an act of survival, proof of a will to live even when life was nothing but a performance. And in his death, there is something even more haunting. Faced with the ultimate humiliation, Sporus chose the one form of resistance left to him. He took his own fate into his hands. In refusing to play Vitellius' cruel theatre, he rejected the final attempt to erase his dignity. That choice, tragic as it was a reclamation of self. History has remembered him as a curiosity, as a symbol of Nero's madness. But what if we remembered him differently? What if we recognized him not as a ghost, not as an ornament, not as a symbol, but as a human being? A boy robbed of identity, yet still capable of asserting the final word over his own life. The echoes of Sporus' story force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, grief, and cruelty. His tragedy reveals how absolute authority can consume not only empires, but individuals, how the desires of one man can strip another of everything, even his name. And though 2,000 years have passed, the story of Sporus still lingers, unsettling, unresolved. Because behind every monument to imperial grandeur, behind every gilded palace, there are always hidden stories like his stories of those whose voices were silenced, whose identities were erased, whose suffering was turned into spectacle. Sporus may have been a footnote in the histories of Rome, but in truth, he was something far more important. A reminder that every empire is built not only on power and glory, but also on lives broken in silence. Sporus' story ends in silence, but the questions it raises still echo. Who was he before Nero claimed him? What dreams did he carry as a boy raised in the imperial household? Did he imagine a life of service, perhaps of quiet influence before fate twisted his resemblance into a curse? These are the fragments lost to history, erased the moment the emperor decided his face looked too much like another's. What remains is not the boy, but the mask he was forced to wear. And yet, even through the distortions of ancient writers, his humanity flickers. We see it in his endurance, living day after day in the shadow of Nero's delusion. We see it in his performance, his ability to survive by becoming what was demanded of him, even when it meant sacrificing his own self. And we see it, most of all, in his death, his refusal to endure one more humiliation, his choice to reclaim, in the final moment, what had been denied him all his life, the right to decide his own fate. That act transformed Sporus from victim into something more complicated. His life was shaped by cruelty, but his death was shaped by defiance. He was not allowed to be himself in life, but in choosing the manner of his death, he seized the last word. And what of Nero? History remembers him as the tyrant who set fire to his own city, who sang while Rome burned, who mutilated a boy to soothe his grief. Yet in remembering Nero, we must also remember those who were caught in the orbit of his madness, those like Sporus, who bore the consequences of an emperor's unchecked will. To tell Sporus' story is to remind ourselves that power is never abstract. It is always human, always measured in the lives it touches and the voices it silences. Perhaps the Greatest tragedy is that we will never know who Sporus truly was. His identity was overwritten, his story buried under the weight of another's. He has come down to us as an empress he never was, a wife he never wanted to be, a ghost forced to haunt another man's grief. But in death, he stepped outside the script. He was no longer Nero's doll, no longer Rome's ornament, no longer the ghost of Popper. He was Sporus, unknown, unremembered, but finally his own. 2,000 years later, his story still unsettles us because it asks a question we cannot ignore. What happens when absolute power collides with human vulnerability? The answer, written in Sporus' life, is a warning about cruelty disguised as love, about grief twisted into obsession, about the terrible cost when one person's will is allowed to erase another's existence. Sporus may have died in obscurity, but his story survives. And in remembering him not as Nero's empress, not as Popper reborn, but as himself a boy forced into silence, yet capable of one final act of defiance, we restore to him the humanity history denied. This is his legacy. Not the jewels, not the silks, not the mask, but the choice to reclaim his fate, even in death.